Hello everyone! Welcome back to Langmaster Learning System with me, Amanda. Today, we will practice your listening skills with a meaningful story. Let's get started. Once upon a time, in a small village, there was a poor farmer living with his small family in a tiny house. He had 2 lovely children. After his wife gave birth to their first child, she passed away. 2 years later, he married another woman and the second child was born. When the winter came, the stepmother worried about her dear child, so she immediately sewed him a coat and stuffed it full of cotton. She gave her child the warmest coat she had ever made. However, she was scared of being scolded by the farmer, so she made another coat for the other child. The first child received the coat and wore it immediately. On the next day, the whole family went to the town nearby. The 2 children both wore their new coats. The farmer was so satisfied. However, when they were on their way, the farmer noticed that his first child was shaking. Then he looked at his second child. His cheeks were ruddy and showed no sign of being cold. He shouted, "Why do you keep shaking while wearing a warm coat? If other people look at you, what will they think about your stepmother? Stop shaking." He used a big rod and whipped his child's back with anger. After the first whip, the whole coat became tattered. What fell out of the coat was not the warm cotton, but it was hard and long straw. The father was shocked. He couldn't believe his eyes. He stared at the stepmother. She trembled and couldn't even look at the farmer. The farmer couldn't believe his wife would treat his poor son in this way. He angrily announced that the stepmother would no longer live in their house. However, the first child immediately went down on his knees and begged, "Father, please, don't evict her. If you do, then my brother will not have a mother to live with. I don't have a warm coat, but I can put more clothes on. But my brother, he would lose his mom forever." The farmer was amazed, and he was very pleased. He rubbed his son's head and consented. The stepmother was shocked. She couldn't believe the child she hated the most would care about both her and her dear child. She hugged the kind child, and from then on, she treated the 2 children the same. 1 cotton coat for the second child, and 1 cotton coat for the first child. And in the end, their family lived happily together throughout the cold winter. Once upon a time, in a great forest, a mother lived with her child under a small tent. One day, the mother fell sick as she worked all day and night to earn a living. Her son broke down into tears. He didn't know what to do. Then his neighbor showed up. "Don't worry, kid. If you take good care of your mother, she will get over this illness soon." The naive child believed in the only encouragement he received. But the neighbor, he knew how terrible the situation was, but the words just couldn't come out of his mouth. The child held the hope tightly. and he thought he could do something for his mom. He went inside the forest to pick berries for her. He started picking berries. There were green berries and red berries. The red were sweet and yummy, while the green ones were extremely sour. Then he came home. He gave all of the red berries to his mother and ate the green ones. His mother was very touched. That night, the child stayed up all night to look after his mother. When he tired, he tied a small string in his hand and his mother's hand. So that way, when his mother needed him, he would immediately awake. After 2 days, his mother finally got over the illness. She was very pleased and surprised at the same time, as people said she would not pass. She embraced her son, and she was very proud to be his mother. Then, the story about a kind child who successfully saved his mother spread all over the village. The Golden Goose. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Dummling. He was the youngest son in the family. One day, the eldest brother decided to go into the great forest to fetch wood. The mother sent him with some things to eat and drink. When he went inside the forest, he came across a little old man. The old man miserably said, "Can you give me a piece of cake out of your pocket and let me have a draught of your wine? I am so hungry and thirsty." However, the son denied him. If he gave the man his food, he would have had nothing to eat on that day. Man alone. While chopping the trees, he cut himself in the arm and had to return to his home with nothing. Then the second son took his place and entered the great forest. The mother again prepared some things for him to bring. While entering the forest, he met the tiny old man. The old man asked for the same thing, a piece of cake and a drink of wine. The second son scolded and sacked the old man with anger, and he left just like the first son. However, while chopping the trees, he struck his leg and he had to be carried home by someone else. As there was no wood, Dummling asked his father for permission to go inside the forest to fetch wood. Just like the two brothers, he met the tiny old man. The old man once again asked the same question, but this time Dummling said, "I have only cinder cake and sour beer. If that pleases you, we will sit down and eat." Because of his kind heart, the old man told him if he cut down an old tree in a forest, he would find a precious thing. Dummling listened to him and cut the tree down. After that, he found a goose with feathers of pure gold. Then he brought her home. His family was very curious about the bird, and they wanted its feathers. Dumling's sisters then waited until Dummling went out to pull out a feather. Nevertheless, when touching the goose, their hands were glued to the feather, and they could not pull them out. In the next morning, when Dummling woke up, he found his sisters with their hands stuck in the goose. Afterward, Dummling lifted the goose and went to the field, followed by his sisters. People then saw them, and they tried to pull the girls out. But when they touched them, they just stuck immediately. A boy held a goose, and 7 people were running after him. As soon as he came to the town, he heard that the king said whoever made his daughter laugh could marry the princess. Then Dummling met the king and the princess. He showed him the goose and 7 people sticking their hands in the golden goose. As he succeeded in making the princess laugh, Dummling asked to marry the princess. But the king required that the one who married the princess must have the ability to drink a warehouse full of wine. Dummling suddenly remembered the tiny old man who loved wine, and he asked for his help. The man agreed. After drinking all the wine, the king continuously gave him another condition. The man who married his daughter must eat a mountain of bread. Dummling once again asked for help from the tiny and mysterious old man, and he agreed. However, the king informed the third condition. He must sail a ship that could sail on the ground and in the sea. Give him bread and wine to eat. He thanked Dummling by giving him a special and magical ship which could sail on every surface. Then, finally, Dummling had the princess as his wife. The Singing Bone by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, in a small country, there was a wild boar that was destroying the peasants' fields, killing the cattle, and ripping people apart with its tusks. The king promised a large reward to anyone who could kill this beast, but the beast was so large and strong that no one dared to go near the woods where it lived. Finally, the king proclaimed that whoever could capture or kill the wild boar should have his only daughter in marriage. Now in this country, there lived 2 brothers, sons of a poor man. They declared that they dared to attempt the task. The older one, who was crafty and shrewd, did so out of pride. The younger one, who was innocent and simple, did so because of his kind heart. The king said, "In order to be more sure of finding the beast, you should enter the woods from opposite sides." Thus, the older one entered the woods from the west, and the younger one from the east. After the younger one had walked a little while, a little dwarf stepped up to him. He held a black spear in his hand and said, "I am giving you this spear because your heart is innocent and good. With it, you can confidently attack the wild boar. It will do you no harm." He thanked the dwarf, put the spear on his shoulder, and walked on fearlessly. Before long, he saw the beast. It attacked him, but he held the spear toward it, and in its blind fury, it ran into the spear with such force that its heart was slashed in 2. Then he put the monster on his back and turned towards home, intending to take it to the king. Emerging from the other side of the woods, he came to a house where people were making merry, drinking wine and dancing. His older brother was there too. Thinking that the boar would not run away from him anytime soon, he had decided to drink himself some real courage. When he saw his younger brother coming out of the woods with his booty, his envious and evil heart gave him no peace. He called out to him, "Come in, dear brother! Rest and refresh yourself with a beaker of wine." The younger brother, suspecting no evil, went in and told him about the good dwarf who had given him the spear with which he had killed the boar. The older brother kept him there until evening, and then they set forth together. After dark, they came to a bridge over a brook, and the older brother let the younger one go first. When the younger brother reached the middle above the water, the older one gave him such a blow from behind that he fell down dead. He buried him beneath the bridge, took the boar, and delivered it to the king, pretending that he had killed it. With this, he received the king's daughter in marriage. When his younger brother did not return, he said, "The boar must have ripped him apart," and everyone believed it. But as nothing remains hidden from God, this black deed was also to come to light. After many long years, a shepherd was driving his herd across the bridge and saw a little snow-white bone lying in the sand below. Thinking that it would make a good mouthpiece, he climbed down, picked it up, and then carved out of it a mouthpiece for his horn. When he blew into it for the first time, to his great astonishment, the bone began to sing by itself. "Oh, my dear shepherd, you are blowing on my little bone. My brother killed me and buried me beneath the bridge to get the wild boar for the daughter of the king." "What a wonderful horn," said the shepherd. "It sings by itself. I must take it to the king." When he brought it before the king, the horn again began to sing its little song. The king understood it well, and had the earth beneath the bridge dug up. Then the whole skeleton of the murdered man came to light. The wicked brother could not deny the deed. He was sewn into a sack and drowned alive. The murdered man's bones were laid to rest in a beautiful grave in the churchyard. Sleeping Beauty by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a king who had a beautiful baby daughter. He invited all the fairies in the kingdom to come to the christening, but unfortunately, there was one that he forgot to invite. And this fairy was much less like a fairy and more like a witch. She came anyway, but as she passed the baby's cradle, she said, "When you are 16, you will injure yourself with a spindle and die." "Oh no!" screamed the king in horror. A good fairy quickly chanted a magic spell to change the curse as best as she could. When the princess hurts herself, she will fall into a very deep sleep instead of dying. As the years went by, the little princess grew and became the most beautiful girl in the whole kingdom. Her father was always very careful to keep her away from spindles, but on her 16th birthday, the princess wandered through the castle and came into a room where an old servant was spinning. "What are you doing?" she asked the servant. "I'm spinning. Haven't you seen a spindle before?" "No, let me see it." The servant handed the girl the spindle, and she pricked herself with it and with a sigh dropped to the floor. The terrified old woman hurried to tell the king. Beside himself with anguish, the king remembered the curse of the witch-like fairy and did his best to awaken his daughter. The court doctors and wizards were called, but all to no avail. The princess could not be wakened from her deep sleep. The good fairy who managed to avoid the worst of the curse came too, and the king said to her, "When will my daughter waken?" "I don't know," the fairy admitted sadly. "In a year's time? 10 years? 20? The king went on. "Maybe in 100 years' time, who knows?" said the fairy. "Oh, what will awaken my daughter?" asked the king. "Love," replied the fairy. "If a man of pure heart were to fall in love with her, that would bring her back to life." "How can a man fall in love with a sleeping girl?" sobbed the king, and so heartbroken was he that a few days later he died. The sleeping princess was taken to her room and laid on the bed surrounded by garlands of flowers. She was so beautiful, with a sweet face, not like those of the dead, but pink like those who are sleeping peacefully. The good fairy said to herself, "When she awakens, who is she going to see around her? Strange faces and people she doesn't know? I can never let that happen. It would be too painful for this unfortunate girl." So the fairy cast a spell, and everyone that lived in the castle, soldiers, ministers, guards, servants, ladies, pages, cooks, maids, and knights, all fell into a deep sleep, wherever they were at that very moment. "Now," thought the fairy, "when the princess wakes up, they too will awaken, and life will go on from there." And she left the castle, now wrapped in silence. Not a sound was to be heard. Nothing moved except for the clocks. But when they too ran down, they stopped, and time stopped with them. Not even the faintest rustle was to be heard, only the wind whistling round the turrets. Not a single voice, only the cry of birds. The years sped past. In the castle grounds, the trees grew tall. The bushes became thick and straggling. The grass invaded the courtyards, and the creepers spread up the walls. In 100 years, a dense forest grew up. Now, it so happened that a prince arrived in that kingdom. He was the son of a king in a country close by. The prince was young, handsome, and melancholy. One day, while wandering on his trusty steed, he arrived at the dark forest. Being adventurous, he decided to explore it. He made his way through slowly and with a struggle, for the trees and bushes had grown in a thick tangle. Hours passed, and he was about to turn his horse and go back, but he thought he could see something through the trees. He pushed back the branches. There in front of him stood a castle with high towers. The young man stood stock still in amazement. "I wonder who this castle belongs to," he thought. The young prince rode on towards the enormous fortress. The drawbridge was down, and holding his horse by the reins, he slowly crossed over it. Immediately, he saw the inhabitants of the castle standing still all over the steps, the hall, and courtyard, and said to himself, "Good heavens, they're dead!" But in a moment, he realized that they were sound asleep. "Wake up! Wake up!" he shouted. But nobody moved. Still thoroughly astonished, he entered the castle and again discovered more people lying fast asleep on the floor. As though led by a hand in the complete silence, the prince finally reached the room where the beautiful princess lay fast asleep. For a long time he stood, gazing at her face, so full of serenity, so peaceful, lovely, and pure. Overcome by emotion, he went close, lifted the girl's little white hand, and gently kissed it. At that kiss, the princess suddenly opened her eyes and awoke from her long, long sleep. The spell was broken. Seeing the prince beside her, she murmured, "Oh, you have come at last! I was waiting for you in my dream. I've waited so long." The princess rose to her feet, holding out her hands to the prince. Slowly, the whole castle began to wake up too. Everybody rose to their feet, and they all gazed around in amazement, wondering what had happened. When they finally realized, they rushed to the princess. A few days later, the castle that shortly before stood in silence now rang with the sound of singing, music, and happy laughter at the great party given in honor of the prince and princess, who were getting married, and they lived happily ever after. The end. Cinderella by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a very beautiful and kind girl
who had lost both her parents and was left with her stepmother. This woman had 2 very ugly daughters, but their mother spoiled them and always made the orphaned girl do all the difficult housework. Because of this, she found herself often kneeling on the floor, covered in dirt and ashes, exhausted and with her clothes torn to rags. Since she was always dirty from ash and cinders, the townspeople called her Cinderella. In her tiny room in the attic, Cinderella treasured the beautiful dreams of a better life she had while she slept. A dream is a wish your heart makes while you're fast asleep, she explained to her only friends, the mice who lived in the attic with her. One day, the prince announced a grand ball and invited all young women who would like to marry him so that he could choose the most beautiful and make her his princess. The stepmother prepared her 2 daughters with the best ball gowns and made them up so that they would be pretty. But she prohibited Cinderella from attending the ball. She ordered her to stay at home, mopping the floor and preparing dinner so that it would be ready when the 3 of them returned home. Cinderella obeyed, but as she watched her stepsisters leave for the ball at the royal palace, she couldn't help but feel miserable and began to cry. Suddenly, her fairy godmother appeared, telling her she didn't have to worry. She would be able to go to the ball too, but with one condition. She must return home before the palace clock struck midnight. Cinderella looked down at the rags she was wearing. "I can't go to the ball wearing this," she cried. The fairy godmother waved her magic wand and said the magic words, "Bibbidi boppidi boo," and transformed Cinderella's ragged clothes into a beautiful ball gown with a pair of glass slippers on her feet. She was exquisitely beautiful. "But how will I get to the royal palace?" Cinderella asked. Her fairy godmother waved her magic wand again and turned a pumpkin into a beautiful golden carriage, and turned 4 white mice into horses to pull the carriage. Cinderella climbed into the carriage and left for the palace. As the carriage rolled away, her fairy godmother shouted a reminder. "Don't forget, you must return before the clock strikes 12. When Cinderella arrived and entered the ballroom, everyone gazed at her in awe. The prince, seeing her incredible beauty, approached her and danced the whole night with her. Nobody recognized her, not even her stepsisters. It was just like her most beautiful dreams. Suddenly, the palace clock rang out. It was midnight already. Cinderella dashed across the room as her ball gown began to transform back into rags, and she ran so fast that she lost one of her glass slippers on the palace stairs. The prince found the slipper and kept it, intent on finding the mysterious young woman again. The next day, the prince announced that he would marry whoever fit into the glass slipper. All of his heralds searched the kingdom for the woman to whom the shoe belonged. Finally, They arrived at the house of Cinderella's stepmother. Her first stepsister's feet would not fit into the shoe, and the second stepsister couldn't fit either. When the herald asked if there were any other young women in the house, the stepsisters laughed and said, "Only Cinderella, the girl who is covered in soot and ash." But when Cinderella arrived, they saw that her foot fit perfectly in the glass slipper. The stepsisters were furious. The prince was overjoyed and decided to marry Cinderella. They had a beautiful wedding at the palace and lived happily ever after.
I'm sorry I lied. Jenny was so happy about the house they had found. For once in her life, she would be staying on the right side of town. She unpacked her things with such great ease. As she watched her new curtains blow in the breeze, she thought about how wonderful it was to have her own room. The school year would be starting, and she would have friends over soon. There will be sleepovers and parties. She was so happy. It's just the way she wanted her life to be. On the first day of school, everything went great. She made new friends and even got a date. She thought, I want to be popular, and I'm going to be, because I just got a date with the star of the team. To be well known in this school, you had to have clout, and dating this guy would surely help her out. There was only one problem. Her parents had said she was too young to date. Well, I just won't tell them the entire truth. They won't know the difference. What's there to lose? Jenny asked to stay with her friends that night. Her parents frowned, but said, all right. She got ready for the big event excitedly. However, as she rushed around preparing, she began to feel guilty about all the lies. She got rid of her guilt by telling herself that she would have fun with the pizza, the party, and the moonlit ride out. Well, the pizza was good, and the party was great, but the moonlit ride would have to wait, as Jeff was half drunk by then. Despite being half drunk, he kissed her and said that he was fine. The room began to fill with smoke, and Jeff took a puff. Jenny couldn't believe he was smoking that stuff. Soon, Jeff said he was ready to ride to the point, but only after he smoked another joint. They jumped into the car for the moonlit ride, without any consideration on whether or not he was too drunk to drive. They finally made it to the point at last, and Jeff started trying to make a pass at Jenny. A pass is not what Jenny wanted at all. And by pass, I don't mean playing football. Perhaps my parents were right. Maybe I am too young. Boy, how could I ever be so dumb? With all of her might, she pushed Jeff away and said, please take me home. I don't want to stay. Jeff cranked up the engine and floored the gas pedal. In a matter of seconds, they were going too fast. As Jeff drove on in a fit of wild anger, Jenny knew that her life was in danger. She begged and pleaded for him to slow down, but he just got faster as they neared the town. Just let me get home. I'll confess that I lied. I really went out for a moonlit ride. Then all of a sudden, she saw a big flash. Oh God, please help us. We're going to crash. She doesn't remember the force of impact. She only remembered that everything went black. She felt someone remove her from the twisted rubble and cried out, call an ambulance. These kids are in trouble. She heard voices, but it was only a few words at best. She knew there were 2 cars involved in the wreck. She wondered to herself if Jeff was all right and if the people in the other car were alive. She woke up to sad faces in the hospital. "You've been in a wreck, and it looks pretty bad." These voices echoed inside her head as they gently told her that Jeff was dead. They said, "Jenny, we've done all we can do. However, it looks as if we'll lose you too." "What about the people in the other car?" Jenny asked. "We're sorry, Jenny, they died." Jenny prayed, "God, forgive me for what I've done. I only wanted to have just one night of fun. Tell the families of those involved in the accident that I'm sorry I've made their lives dim, and I wish I could return their families to them. Tell Mom and Dad I'm sorry I lied to them and that it's my fault so many have died. Oh, nurse, won't you please tell them that for me?" The nurse stood there solemnly. She never agreed. She held Jenny's hand with tears in her eyes, and a few moments later, Jenny died. A man asked the nurse, "Why didn't you do your best to grant that girl her one last request?" She looked at the man with sadness, because the people in the other car were her mom and dad. Once upon a time, there was a poor woodcutter who lived with his wife and his 2 children, living by the side of a great forest. His children were Hansel and Gretel. The family was so poor that the father couldn't even purchase any bread at all. As he dreadfully thought about this, he groaned and said to his wife, "What is to become of us? How are we to feed our poor children when we no longer have anything even for ourselves?" The wife said, "Early tomorrow morning, we will take the children out into the forest. There, we will light a fire for them and give each of them one more piece of bread, and then we will go to our work and leave them alone." "No, wife," said the man, "I will not do that. How can I bear to leave my children alone in the forest?" The wife continued, "Oh, you fool! Then we must all 4 die of hunger." She then left him no peace until he consented. The hunger made the 2 children awaken, and they could hear all the conversation. Gretel wept bitter tears and said to Hansel, "Now all is over with us." "Be quiet, Gretel," said Hansel. "Do not distress yourself. I will soon find a way to help us." When day dawned, but before the sun had risen, the stepmother awoke the 2 children. She said, "Get up, you sluggards! We are going into the forest to fetch wood." Then they all set out together on the way to the forest. Hansel and Gretel were each given a piece of bread to eat. When they had walked a short time, Hansel had been dropping white pebble stones out of his pocket on the road as a trail. When they had reached the middle of the forest, the father said, "Now, children, pile up some wood, and I will light a fire so that you are not cold." After he lit the fire, the man and his wife left the children. Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire, and when noon came, they fell fast asleep. And when the full moon had risen, Hansel took his little sister by the hand and followed the pebbles which he left throughout the way. Then they finally found the way back to their house. Not long afterwards, the family ran out of reserved foods. The man's heart was heavy, but still he agreed to leave his children in the forest for a second time. The children, once again, had heard the conversation. At midnight, Hansel again got up and wanted to go out and pick up pebbles to mark the way back home. But the stepmother had locked the door, so Hansel could not go out. Early in the morning came the woman and took the children out of their beds. Their piece of bread was given to them, but it was smaller than the time before. On the way into the forest, Hansel crumbled his bread in his pocket. He threw all the crumbs on the path. Then the children were left in the forest a second time. When the moon came, Hansel and Gretel began to follow the crumbs, but they found no crumbs, for the many thousands of birds which fly about in the woods had picked them all up. They were very hungry, for they had nothing to eat but 2 or 3 berries, which grew on the ground. When it was midday, they saw a beautiful snow-white bird sitting on a bough. It spread its wings and flew away before them, and they followed it until they reached a little house. When they approached the little house, they saw that it was built of bread and covered with cakes, and that the windows were made of clear sugar. Due to their hunger, the 2 children started eating different parts of the house. Then a soft voice cried from the parlor, "Nibble, nibble, gnaw. Who is nibbling at my little house?" The children answered, "The wind, the wind, the heaven-born wind," and went on eating without disturbing themselves. Suddenly, the door opened, and a woman as old as the hills, who supported herself on crutches, came creeping out. Hansel and Gretel were so terribly frightened. The old woman, however, nodded her head and said, "Oh, you dear children, who has brought you here? Do come in and stay with me. No harm shall happen to you." She led them into her little house. Good food was set before them, including milk and pancakes, with sugar, apples, and nuts. Afterwards, 2 pretty little beds were covered with clean white linen. Hansel and Gretel lay down in them, and they thought they were in heaven. However, the old woman had only pretended to be so kind, when she was in fact a wicked witch. When a child came to this house, she would cook and eat the child. The woman locked Hansel in behind a grated door. Then she forced Gretel to cook meals for her brother, so the witch could soon eat him. When 4 weeks had gone by, and Hansel still remained thin, she was seized with impatience and decided that she would not wait any longer. She decided to cook Hansel. Early in the morning, the witch pushed poor Gretel near to the oven. "Creep in," said the witch. She also told Gretel, "See if it is properly heated, so that we can put more bread in." Gretel said, "I do not know. How do I get in?" "Silly goose," said the old woman. "The door is big enough. Just look, I can get in myself." And she crept up and pushed the witch into the oven. Then Gretel shut the iron door. Gretel found Hansel and cried, "Hansel, we are saved." Then they went into the witch's house, and they saw in every corner there stood chests full of pearls and jewels. They took some jewelry and then began to run and came back to their house. The man was very miserable since he had left the children in the forest and still regretted it a lot. He hugged the two children and was glad that they could come back. Then all anxiety was at an end, and they lived together in perfect happiness. Did you like the story? If you did, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Leave some comments on what you want to listen to next. I'm Amanda, and this is Langmaster Learning System. See you next time.